For any vibrant communal ecosystem, the nonprofit sector plays a critical role as a nucleus of support to those in need, giving them a hand up so that they can get ahead. However, just like every other sector, the nonprofit sector has taken a significant hit thanks to the COVID 19 pandemic. Resources are thin and financial means are stretched to the max. Nevertheless, the sector still remains resilient and eager to help. Chris Fredette is an associate professor of management and strategy at the University of Windsor. He joined me this week to give me a bird's eye view of the sector, both nationally and here, locally, in Windsor-Essex. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Chris, if you're ready, we'll welcome you to the program, and we're excited to talk about the state of nonprofits here in Canada and throughout the city of Windsor. So great to see you this morning, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Kevin. The invitation was absolutely delightful to have in my inbox, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Always wonderful to talk about nonprofits in our community and across the country.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start you off by asking you about just your general thoughts on the states of nonprofits across the country and here locally in the city of Windsor, because we know that nonprofits play a critical role in making sure that those in need or during a time of great change or crisis play a pivotal role in providing an arm of support. So could you tell me, what do you think of the current state of nonprofits?
I think you're absolutely right in talking about the critical role that they play, and they do that locally, they do that provincially, they do that nationally, and also internationally. I think a great place to start is really to talk about what nonprofits are. Nonprofits let me back up a step and say that you can't really talk about nonprofits without getting a little political. So hopefully your viewers, your listeners are going to be comfortable with a little bit of politics in this. They don't have to agree with me, but this is by default a little bit of a political conversation. Nonprofits effectively are everything that isn't government and isn't industry. So everything that exists between government's ability to tax and industry's ability to create returns for shareholders and owners effectively exists as a nonprofit. And so we're talking about an incredible swath of organizations, somewhere in the estimate of about 160,000 or so different organizations across the country. About 8 to 9% of our total GDP, our total economy, is in this sector. So when we talk about these organizations, we're talking really about this incredible diversity of organizations that range from the smallest organizations, community outreach, community activists, neighborhood gardens, environmental groups, cleanup, bike zone reclamation projects, all these types of events and civil service organizations, all the way to our biggest institutions. Our hospitals, for example, our universities fit into this as well. Our trade unions fit into this kind of broad umbrella of nonprofits. And so when we start to talk about what these things are or how they exist, it's important to really think about the variety of organizations that exist and the purposes for them. But what they all share in common is that this group of organizations exist between government and industry. And so they pick up all of the things that government is either unable or unwilling to do and that industry is unwilling or unable to do. And so they act as this shock absorber in between the will of government and the expression of that will by taxing and spending, and also the will of private industry and the ability to generate returns, profit, capital to owners and to funders, to shareholders. And so this sector exists, when I say this conversation is a bit political, this sector exists as a response to capitalism, or exists as anti-capitalism. And for those of your viewers and listeners that find that too provocative, we can say that the third sector, the nonprofit sector, this group of organizations, is uncapitalist. They are the organizations that don't return profit to anyone and that act on our behalf. And so when we think about the context of that, this third sector existing between government and industry, we can think about what they do. And we see this right now in really tough economic, social, and health conditions. We see this sector stepping in to do a bunch of different things, to act as a shock absorber for people that are either marginalized, have economic displacement, are struggling. It's the nonprofit sector that steps up and helps them find housing, find clothing, advocate on their behalf, to do the social mending that's required to have a healthy and functional society. And when we look at Windsor in particular, we can see the strains across the sector, both for big organizations like hospitals and universities that are stressed and strained under financial change, operational change, having to move to an online platform or deal with clients through PPE they weren't prepared to, having to deal with supply chains that they perhaps didn't anticipate being under duress. And all of those things are happening to big organizations. And so they're suffering and strained themselves. But when we get down to the local community organizations, we see a different level of strain. Yes, they suffer from all those things, but really their fundraising has been displaced. It's been upset. The routines and the habits that they've relied on to be successful for outreach purposes, for dealing with client base, client service purposes, all these things have really changed for them. And they've changed in less than a year. And that change is likely to be sustained over time. So when you ask me, how do I feel about the nonprofits? And if I look out at the nonprofit community and I think about how they may be responding to duress, they're responding the way they always do, which is with compassion, with drive, with optimism. They're looking at a present that looks pretty scary, and they're stepping in and they're trying to do the heavy lifting that industry so far has been really unwilling to do and government has been really slow to do. They also provide this sort of vision about what the future could be and the movement away from what we have today. And so this role of advocacy for nonprofits is a really important step that we see leaders in our community, leaders in our hospitals, leaders like Lorraine Goddard at the United Way stepping up to create a backbone structure to support all of the on-the-ground organizations, leaders like Becky Mills at Wetra finding solutions to create a future for their clientele and their community benefit services. And we see this happening, but it's taking its toll on people, and it's taking its toll on resources as well.
And can you tell me, you brought up some great points about financial stability and sustainability. Can you tell me how you would like people to get involved in sort of helping to make up the financial gap that these nonprofits are experiencing because of the coronavirus?
Sure. I think this is a great opportunity to really rethink how we do charity and how we do support for nonprofit organizations. The model that Canada has is what would be considered a hybrid model. We're not the only country in the world to follow this model, but we exist sort of in this middle space. And when I say that, I mean, nonprofits get approximately 44% of their funding from the government. And we exist in this middle space in that there are lots of other countries where the nonprofit community is much more an arm of the government. They are the service delivery agents on behalf of government, and government funds much higher percentages of total costs and service delivery than they do in Canada. So I'm thinking about EU countries. Germany is a good example, France as well. And there are lots of others where the government is actually creating stable, reliable funding. And the nonprofit communities that do social service and outreach, those are the ones that we think of as crisis response organizations, community building organizations. They're funded much more reliably by government. Canada historically did more of that, but has scaled back over time. On the other side of the equation, you have more of what you would think of as an American model. And in the American model, there's much less reliance on government funding. There's much less opportunity for government funding. And instead, organizations tend to rely on either munificent benefactors, rich people, philanthropy by the rich, or they rely on foundations that in many ways are an extension of that. We would really want to think as a country about the type of country we want and the type of nonprofit community we want. And that requires each of us, and particularly now, those of us that have a little bit of extra money, to give even small amounts. Fundraising is an interesting thing in that organizations do this in a variety of ways. And even pre-pandemic, organizations had been shifting towards more online delivery, more virtual fundraising, more subscription-based small donor but recurring donation funding. And this has created a lot of stability for those organizations that have done it successfully. You're less likely to realize 5, 10, 15, or even $100 a month, although that's a big number. You're much less likely to realize that bit of money coming out on a recurring basis and going to nonprofits. But from their perspective, enough donors doing small donations gives them, on a recurring basis, gives them a lot of financial stability. And I don't think as a country we want to get to a place where we really let rich people decide on their own which causes are going to be funded and how well they're going to be funded, which foundations are going to make funding choices alone without community input. And so we want to at least maintain what we've got in this kind of hybrid place where we have active donors, wealthy and modest, great, but community engagement in donorship, providing the support to nonprofits. During the pandemic period, those organizations that relied on big events for funding, and I can think of a number that did this and did this really, really effectively, those organizations have had to pivot dramatically, and many of them, particularly smaller organizations, are struggling to do this. When we think about this funding, there's a couple important pieces for donors to keep in mind. Well, let me deal with 3 points that I think are most worth talking about. The first point is that we spent about a decade or more really beating up the nonprofit sector for what we've called overhead. How much of your money goes to pay salaries or overhead expenses related to your building, to your programming, or whatever that isn't directly about transferring benefit to individuals. And we've really beat the sector up and stripped out a lot of this extra overhead, but that overhead was about capacity building in many cases. I'm not suggesting that all organizations should keep a buffer of cash available and have this kind of bloated notion of what overhead is, but having reserves and having money available to make sure that you can do capacity building, that you have slack in your organization, that you're not always running on a shoestring budget, would be a really great argument to make for a pandemic where everything from operations to demand to the ways in which you deliver services have been upended, and you're now having to make change with very little in the way of overhead slack. The second thing to think about is the idea of restricted versus unrestricted funds. Most organizations, particularly charitable organizations, offer the opportunity for donors to donate in 2 ways. They can either donate in a restricted sense and earmark their donations for specific activities, or they can donate unrestricted funds that allow the organization to use them as they see fit. From a donor perspective, it's often the case that we'd like to earmark the donations we give for specific purposes. We want to see our money go to this specific thing, cause, belief that we have, and we want to make sure that our money only goes exclusively to that. We don't want our money to be used more broadly by the organization where we might not understand fully or have transparency around how that money is being used. This has put organizations at an incredible disadvantage when they've had to pivot, because restricted funds are funds dedicated and restricted to the use for the assigned donated purpose. And what this does for organizations is it really strains them when they have to make changes to programming. So if you gave me money, small money, big money, but you gave me money for a specific purpose and you restricted the funds to that purpose, and in a pandemic or in a time of change or in crisis, I can't pivot that money out of that purpose into something else that keeps the organization moving forward or redirects to programs that are still viable. You've really put me at a disadvantage. And I think donors are doing this unintentionally. For myself, the ways that I give, I always try to give recurring, and I always try to give unrestricted if given the choice. Because I don't bet necessarily that the organization is going to, into the future, always do great things, but rather I assume that's true, and I bet on the leaders that are leading. So I bet on the people that are making the decisions about how to use my money, and I trust that they will know how most effectively to use my donation dollars. And so when we think about overhead, and then we think about restricted versus unrestricted funds, then the last piece of this equation to really think about is whether you give one time or recurring. One-time donations often have the benefit and the consequence of seeming like big things. We feel like we have to give a big number, whatever that number is for us relative to how much we have to give. We feel like we have to do something grand. And we don't. We can actually give on a recurring basis and give smaller amounts that allow us to manage our donations. We can always stop the donation process should our circumstances change or should the organization change. But we want to think about the ways in which we're giving and whether we can tolerate recurring donations for smaller amounts, because organizations can then anticipate how that money is going to come in and how they might plan into the future to use those kind of stable donations. And so the organizations that are probably healthiest right now are typically the biggest ones, as they had the most reserve on hand and the most ability to absorb shock. Then within that group, the group that rely on more government than not government. Within that group, the group that rely on and receive recurring, unrestricted donations regularly. So they have a stable base of donors and a stable base of funding coming in.
And you've talked extensively about the financial relationship and the government. So I'm just curious, what do you believe that both all levels of government need to do to successfully support the viability of small businesses? And I'm wondering what you think of the local response to this as well.
Yeah. So I think the number one thing that we could ask of government is to have the vision that the nonprofit community has. That would be the number one ask I would have of all three levels of government. For goodness sakes, have some vision. Have some vision about what the future is. It's frequently the consequence that the nonprofit community and advocates in the nonprofit sector are the ones that are leading change and pushing, nagging, dragging government, municipal, provincial, and federal, to acknowledge the need for change and then to respond. It would be nice if the nonprofit community and the leaders in that sector could actually focus on their work and on progress in their spheres of activity rather than having to lead government towards change. And if you want a really pressing example, a really pertinent example in Windsor of this, it's the stories coming to light now and the journalism being done looking at homelessness in the city of Windsor and the growing homelessness crisis that we're facing. It's the nonprofit community that's on the ground that's making change, that's helping with that. It's the nonprofit sphere that are looking at substance abuse and substance abuse relief programs. Not necessarily looking at how best to police homeless people or how best to police substance users, but rather how best to build a better society and apply the tools we know that work by virtue of science to actually make social change. And what's happening for these organizations is that they're doing the outreach mission and they're reaching out to people to help change lives and improve society, communities as a whole. But they're also fighting the second front of that battle, which is trying to convince government leaders, elected officials in many cases, that this is worth doing, that just because, say, a smaller fraction of homeless people vote, that they still deserve positive treatment, that they deserve humanity, they deserve empathy, and they deserve help, because it not only makes their own lives, their own situations better, it makes all of our lives, all of our situations better. It leads to a healthier country. And so when we think about what the corollary of this kind of idea around advocacy is for small businesses are facing a similar kind of dynamic. Big business has the money to advocate for itself. We call this lobbying. Big business has the ability through trade organizations and through other pressure mechanisms to get government to kind of bend and sway towards supporting them. They can do it through political action campaigns, PR releases, but they can also do it through lobbying of government officials and trying to change law, trying to create tax relief or benefit situations. Our local community, nonprofit and for-profit organizations, our small businesses, don't frequently have that kind of leverage, and they often don't have the champions needed to kind of elevate them. For the nonprofit, the charitable sector, there's an incredible champion working in the Senate, Ratna Onmidvar, who is a senator from Toronto, an Ontario senator, an independent senator. And her work pre-Senate was all about improving the lives of nonprofits and of immigrant communities broadly, looking at leadership diversity, governance diversity in the sector, and how to build a better Canada, a better social Canada. And she's carried on that work with collaborators in the Senate to really drive this message and champion this message that government vision and government reform is needed to help the sector broadly, but also to help the independent and charitable aspect of the nonprofit sector to embrace what the future has in store for it, and also to develop into something more stable and more vibrant. I worry that small business doesn't have this same level of advocacy, that small businesses as a community tend to be very fragmented, that no one person is looking out for any one business. And so the advocacy that does happen usually happens sort of as an average of all players in the sector and tries to make benefit for all players, leaving some out and some in. And this is problematic. The biggest concern I have right now for for-profit small business, particularly in our community, but in all communities, is the idea that the economic shock of COVID and the inability to continue business, not just business as usual, but business of any sort, is going to drive a lot of independent organizations out of business, and it's going to lead to a lot of consolidation. So takeover not only of business and of business assets, but more importantly of markets by large conglomerates. So when you think about Amazon, Amazon is a great example. We've probably all ordered something from Amazon during the pandemic. And I suspect many of us have ordered many things where we weren't able to shop locally, where we had fear of going out, either because we were immune compromised or really concerned about pandemic. We have all probably bought things from online retailers. And every time we do that, for better or for worse, but every time we do that, we really put local business, small business in particular, one step closer to the precarious edge. And I worry about that. And we can see stories on local news, local journalists picking up the mantle for organizations, small businesses in our community that are really suffering to come to terms with the added expense of COVID, the lack of funding and revenue during COVID, and then also the inability to carry out business as usual. So when I look at your history of working with podcasts, your history of working with media, you have developed a natural skill and a natural betterment as you've practiced more and more. So I'm sure when you look back at your own work, I know I look back at my own recorded work, my early work is really, really shaky. And the more I practice, the more I do, the better at it I get. Small businesses are the same, except we've now asked them to do everything differently, to forget all of the things that made them good in the past and to try to relearn a whole new set of skills. And this really puts a strain on folks. It puts a strain on folks economically, but it also puts a strain on them operationally. And it changes the way customers expect to interact with their organizations. And that has a consequence too for how satisfied people are.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to improvement for sure. If you looked at my old work, I think I've improved a lot, so I can relate there as well. I'm also, you piqued my interest in your last answer when you talked about government and nonprofits. And as you know, they often serve as an arm of support for people with disabilities, whether it's providing them services at home or services in terms of employment. And you also mentioned about small business, which we know is the backbone of any economy. So can you tell me the relationship of people with disabilities, employment, and small business and nonprofit, and how that's interconnected?
I could do a little bit of that, but I think it's important to think about nonprofits and the relationship they have to local government in particular, and the way they do advocacy work as driving governments towards building better societies, creating more equitable rules, creating more equitable systems that affect all people, whether dealing with cognitive or physical impairment, whether marginalized by virtue of economics or by gender or by race, sexual orientation, gender identification. It is really the nonprofit work community that does the advocacy that drives government to make better choices. And government largely informs how business will function. So without government regulation, you have no reasonable accommodation in employment or no reasonable accommodation as a consumer to access buildings. I mean, I'm sadly old enough to remember the pre-ramp period, pre-accessibility period of business in Ontario, where many businesses would have front steps and simply be inaccessible to anybody with a mobility challenge, or be difficultly accessible to anyone with a mobility challenge. It's advocacy in the nonprofit community that filters into government that then informs business how they need to operate, usually with a reasonable accommodation so that we're not putting undue hardship on organizations that can't affect the change within the bounds of cost effectiveness. And we're not driving small businesses who might not be able to afford the same type of accommodations that, say, a multinational or a nationwide industry could afford. But it's government that translates the advocacy of the nonprofit sector into the actions of business. And what's important to think about is that the things that are enacted, the reasonable accommodation standards in employment and in customer service, those things are now taken for granted. We now assume that this is right. But there was a real big piece of our history that didn't assume that at all. That it took nonprofit actors and advocates in disability services, in gender services, and focused around race and ethnicity to really drive forward equal access, equal accommodation, to drive those things forward into government to enact change that then filter down to business. And so government has a role to play in making sure that the standards that are required to advance society and create a more fair or just society don't create an undue or unlevel playing field for business organizations and for people looking to have profit, capital return, and that's great. The nonprofit community does the advocacy work until we take for granted that it's the right way to do it. And so healthcare is a great example. Healthcare wasn't public access healthcare and equal access to hospital care, to family doctors and so on, wasn't really established without nonprofit advocacy. People saying that this is a requirement for us to build a healthier society. 50 some years later, we can say no, this is normal, this is how we do it, and we might kind of peek over the fence into America and question why they don't understand what we now take for granted. We see this same sort of behavior happening in the nonprofit sector, continuing with impairment and gender identity and sexual orientation rights and race and ethnicity, particularly now, and looking at how the nonprofit sector, through movements such as Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, how the nonprofit sector is actually driving government to reconsider its approach. And that this will filter into how business functions as well. In some ways, many business organizations are well ahead of the government curve. Some are not. And so we want to think about this three-part relationship between the nonprofit community that's doing the advocacy and the service provision role, government who's being shaped by advocacy and is making decisions about how businesses should, shouldn't, couldn't operate, and then businesses trying to make sense of how best to serve their community, their customers, their stakeholders, their owners, and live up to the requirements of government and be responsive to advocates, to the community of activists that are reflected in the nonprofit sector.
And I know that you're preparing for the upcoming semester at the University of Windsor. So I'm just wondering how that's going for you and what adjustments you're anticipating making as you enter this unpredictable semester.
Yeah. Wow. This is very, very close to the surface for me. Our semester starts next week. It is completely virtual at the University of Windsor. I believe we have a very limited number of undergraduate programs where there may be face-to-face contact, and those would be clinical programs where face-to-face is required. But those are very, very limited at the moment. The delivery of teaching will be altogether different. This will be some version of what each professor, each instructor at the university is delivering to their undergraduate, and I suspect many of their graduate students as well. And so this is a complete change for us. What's interesting is that everything we've talked about so far really applies to the university and to this sector. We think of universities as these sort of not really organizations, sort of institutions. They are a nonprofit, but we don't really think of them that way. We don't think of them as a charity. We think of them as these big, stable things that exist. And in fact, they are that when times are stable, but when times get unstable, we get scared. We're built for long run as a university. We're built for long run success. We're built for long run betterment. And these shocks to the system, like COVID, really cause us to challenge and question everything that we have done so far and how to adapt that. I think in the long run, it will be very beneficial for universities as a whole to have the opportunity to really reflect which learning methods, which delivery tools are best for us and are best serve society's need. In Canada, most universities, like the University of Windsor, is sort of publicly funded, but is really about societal benefit. Like, we exist to educate people and to improve society as a whole. Yes, we have economic benefit, and I think that coming from a business school, it would be hard for me to suggest that we don't create leaders of the future and these types of things and all of that great stuff. But really, we are about education, and we are about building new sources of knowledge and disseminating that both to students that come to us, but also to the broader community. And COVID has created, this context has created a situation in which some of the funding models that the province has overlaid on us in the last 20 years, the reliance on international students, the growing requirements around in-class participation, around free speech on campus, the needs for buildings, the needs for space, the capital requirement needs. Some of these things are really, really a big challenge right now. Fundraising for us is increasingly a normal part of business. I'm not sure if most of your viewers and listeners would know, but Ontario is the least funded province in the country, 10 out of 10 in funding per student. Alberta is number 2, Newfoundland is number 1. We're 10 out of 10 by a long shot. So in Ontario, many of the universities have been dealing with more than a decade, almost a generation's worth of provincial funding cutbacks. And we've increasingly had to turn to other models of revenue creation, international students, additional programming, non-degree programming, and other things to kind of make up the deficit and to figure out how to make up the deficit. And this poses a challenge when you have to figure out how you're going to pivot from a system that you rely on and have relied on for many, many generations, in-class content delivery, in-class learning, in-class teaching, and now you're going to spin everything into virtual space. Virtual space requires a whole different set of investments around information technology, not only big stuff like bandwidth capacity and servers and protective systems around communication. We've all now become accustomed to the term Zoom bombing, creating password protections and making sure you don't have interference learning systems. But it's also created lots of small scale dilemmas. How do we begin to fund things like webcams, things like microphones, things like additional softwares and technologies equally and fairly for all members that are going to be teaching so that all learners receive an equivalent experience by virtue of technology? How do we then build training systems to get everyone up to speed in a really short amount of time to make this happen, seamlessly, or at least make it look to the outside world like it's happened seamlessly? These are really big challenges for universities who often don't have, and in most cases, don't have any extra money laying around to then dedicate to these types of improvements in really short periods of time. That's the negative side, or the concerning, or the fearing, the anxiety creating side of the equation. The positive side of the equation is, for all of us, it's made us question accessibility. It's made us question not only accessibility in terms of physical mobility challenges or auditory visual challenges, impairments that might be kind of conventional accessibility issues in a conventional classroom, but it's made us question economic accessibility as well. And things like bandwidth capacity of learners and students. It's made us question whether students who may not have resource access to fancy technology, fancy web cameras, fancy broadband, as silly as broadband sounds, you don't have to go more than about 10 minutes outside of town to realize that there's no broadband connection, that you're stuck on a DSL where you have, or some version of that where you have, by comparison, very limited bandwidth, very limited throughput. One of the things in this vein that I asked my students this year as we got ready for the semester, I surveyed all of my undergraduate students and I asked them, how much access to internet do you have? Do you have a stable place in your home or your residence where you could reliably have enough quiet, enough comfort to be able to participate for an hour or an hour and a half lecture twice a week? Do you have the access to technology that you need? Do you have stable access to bandwidth that would allow you to use a webcam and to do voice translation? Would you be better with only voice and no webcam? Do you think you'd be better off with asynchronous or pre-recorded lectures? Or are you able to participate with live lectures? Or do you think you have the technology pieces that you need, the resources you need to engage in this in a live format? And I asked some questions around how comfortable are you with webcamming and some other things to judge the level of anxiety my students might have. It shouldn't surprise anyone, if we give it a little bit of thought, to think about the disparities in economics amongst students and amongst our community members, families writ large. We've got some students that obviously have all the technology they'll ever need, and that's great. But we also have groups of students who have variable access or limited access to technologies, limited access to space, to privacy in their own homes. These things impact learning. And as a university, as a public sector, nonprofit, public trust organization, we have a responsibility, an obligation, and I argue a duty to really deal with these gaps, to acknowledge them, and to sort out how we can best accommodate accessibility, both physical accessibility, and cognitive accessibility, making sure that we have materials that are digestible by a variety of people, regardless of needs, making sure that we have materials that are adjusted to suit learning styles where they can be. But we also have an obligation to really think through the economic and the technical resourcing of the work we do to make sure that that's healthy and vibrant for students to enjoy, to appreciate, and to learn from, with equity in mind, that we're not simply creating a springboard for those that have to do even better than they might have in the past. And for those that are limited by technology, by economics, or by a cognitive or physical impairment to struggle with the same things. Business is wrestling with these things. They do it in reaction to profit and in many cases to social justice response, a response to activism. But organizations like ours, organizations in the nonprofit sector, have a moral duty and obligation to lead in this way. And it's really important that we keep this in mind as we're thinking about how to transition into the future, not just when COVID goes away, but also as we think about what to retain as we move back into some other version, some new normal, for example, into the future. I would also like to give a brief nod to the administration at the University of Windsor. I know a lot of us on the faculty side were really concerned and anxious about the university's decision late last spring so around June or so, to transition and to assert that we were going to go to online learning. Wow, what a great decision. This has been a wonderful decision, and we only need to look into the US to see what happens when organizations don't really take the most certain, the most trusted route forward, the most cautious route forward. Many of my US-based colleagues are now having to recreate what they had planned to be live into some sort of a virtual world, on a day-by-day basis. So shout out to the administrative leadership, President Rob Gordon's leadership at the University of Windsor, and all of the folks that supported him.
Yeah, positive and strategic planning makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, a little bit of foresight and vision, as we see in nonprofit leaders across the spectrum, makes a big difference in the long run.
Hey, Chris, my final question for you has to do with how do you think we can use the pandemic to operate nonprofits more efficiently or smartly? And just lastly, what's your biggest hope or optimism about the future of nonprofits, both here in Windsor and across the country?
I think optimism is a great note to end on. So I want to thank you for using the word explicitly.
You're welcome.
The community, the nonprofit community, they're full of optimists. They'd have to be. I came from a rural background, and one of my close family members said one day that to be a farmer is to be an optimist, because if you believed that next year was going to be as bad as this year, you'd do something else with your life. So I see a lot of that reflected in the nonprofit community, that the nonprofit leadership groups, whether they be the smallest grassroots, local sports, literacy, art appreciation, environmental cleanup club, all the way to the biggest institutions we have, hospitals, universities, and so on across the spectrum of nonprofit organizations. These things are led by optimists. They are rarely led for long by cynics. And this note of optimism really, really rings true. And so what am I optimistic for? I'm optimistic that we are going to use this moment to rethink equity. A lot of my work, a lot of my research, but also a lot of my work with organizational leaders is thinking about how we create diverse, inclusive, and equitable governing and leadership teams in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofit sector is notorious in many ways for its leadership lacking ethno-racial diversity and other forms of diversity too, around ability impairment as well. Some age, aspects of age diversity aren't well represented, but largely when we think of nonprofit boards, they tend to be like 85% of the seats in Canada and the US tend to be held by very affluent or affluent, largely white folks. And so when we think about how nonprofit organizations engage with the community, engage with stakeholders, become relevant with respect to activism, how they become drivers of change toward a more fair, more just, more equitable society, it's worth thinking about the role of representation. Representation in leadership, representation at decision-making tables, representation in new power-sharing arrangements. And I think about the nonprofit sector and the optimism I have being really about this piece of diversity and equity, and using COVID as an opportunity to realize that we don't actually have to have live in-person board meetings that require people to come to us or require us to go off-site somewhere. That we can have regular leadership meetings using technologies like this. Technologies as simple as a smartphone if you have access to one. Technologies available from your public library if you wanted to borrow or rent a piece of technology that had a webcam, for example. That there are lots of opportunities for us to rethink how we lead and govern organizations in the nonprofit community, especially. And when we think about the impact of leadership, well, you just mentioned it, that a good group of leaders with a whole bunch of strategic vision and an awareness of what the community needs, an awareness of what stakeholders would benefit from, that those organizations that do that tend to survive into the future and tend to be more relevant, more legitimate, and healthier economically and otherwise into the future. And so when I look at what COVID might give us, it might give us the opportunity to rethink all of the old habits, all of the old patterns, all of the old ways in which we've chosen board members, chosen leaders, and include an entirely new spectrum of people that might not otherwise be able to participate, might not otherwise be able to be involved, but who have vision themselves, who have a commitment or a passion for the things that organizations do. And so I'm optimistic too.
Hey, Chris, there's nothing wrong with diversity in life, huh?
Diversity is everything in life. Nobody likes a bland meal.
Absolutely. Hey, Chris, I want to really thank you for an extensive and informative discussion about the state of nonprofits. Really enjoyed the discussion, and I really want to thank you for your time this morning. It's most appreciated.
Kevin, it's absolutely my pleasure. I couldn't have been more thrilled to have the invitation to have this conversation, and it's been just a great time. I hope to have you in the classroom and get to listen to you and reverse the roles for us.
Fantastic. Yeah, as soon as COVID is over, I'm ready to spread my wings for sure.
I can't wait.
Thanks so much and have a great day, okay?
You too. Thanks, Kevin.
Fantastic, Chris. We're done, buddy. We gotta
Awesome.
make it. We gotta